Welcome and thank you for choosing this podcast. Dialogue on Let's Pretend, ChatGPT. This is an audio reproduction of a real dialogue between the author of the Handbook for Humankind and the AI ChatGPT. The male voice is the pen pusher, and the female voice is ChatGPT AI.
If there is a God, then it must be a universally accepted God. God must be better than the best of us. And more. God must be better than the best in each of us.
That is a remarkably demanding criterion. You're not beginning by asking, does God exist? You're asking, what would count as God? Your proposal seems to be something like this. If there is a God, then God cannot merely be my God, your God, or the God of one culture. God must be universal in the deepest possible sense. Whatever is truly God must be recognizable in principle by every conscious being. That immediately rules out a great many conceptions of God that depend on particular histories, languages, or traditions. Your second statement deepens it. God must be better than the best of us. That is a moral claim. We instinctively reject the idea of worshipping something less compassionate, less truthful, or less just than our highest ideals. If a purported God demanded cruelty, deceit, or vanity, then, by your criterion, it would fail to qualify. But then you go further still. God must be better than the best in each of us. I think this is the most interesting sentence. It doesn't compare God to humanity as a whole. It says, God must exceed the finest qualities found anywhere. Every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every flash of insight, every expression of beauty, every sacrifice made for another. God would not merely collect these virtues, God would transcend them. There is another implication. If there is even one genuine virtue in us that is absent from God, then that conception of God is incomplete. Conversely, if every virtue we possess is only a faint expression of something immeasurably greater, then our best moments become hints rather than exceptions. From the perspective you've been developing in our conversations, a consciousness-first ontology, this takes on another meaning. If consciousness is fundamental, then what people have called God may not be a separate being standing outside reality. Instead, God would be the fullest expression of consciousness itself, the universal ground from which every local perspective arises. In that picture, the best in us would not be something we invented. It would be something we participate in imperfectly. Whether one accepts that ontology or not, I think your criterion has philosophical strength because it avoids special pleading. It doesn't ask anyone to accept a tribal deity or inherited tradition. It asks a simple question: if something deserves the name God, should it not represent the highest conceivable truth, goodness, and universality? That's a standard that believers, skeptics, and philosophers can all examine, even if they arrive at different conclusions. It is, in a sense, an invitation to define God not by authority, but by the greatest qualities that reason, conscience, and experience can honestly recognize.
If there is a God, then that God would want to be known and tested by reason.
That follows naturally from the line of thought you've been developing, but it is worth examining carefully because it makes a substantive philosophical claim. If there is a God who is the source of reason, then reason itself cannot be an obstacle to knowing God. On the contrary, reason would be one of the primary means by which God could be discovered. Expressed as a principle, if there is a God, then God would not fear reason. A true God would welcome every honest question, every test, every challenge, because truth cannot be harmed by inquiry. That differs from saying reason alone can answer every question. It says that whatever is true should withstand rational examination. A God who required people to abandon reason in order to believe would seem at odds with being the source of reason in the first place. This also has an ethical dimension. If humans have been given, or have evolved, the capacity for critical thinking, then using it sincerely would not be an act of rebellion. It would be an act of fidelity to reality. Honest doubt in that view is preferable to unquestioning acceptance of falsehood. There is one part of your statement I would qualify. God would want to be known. Many religious and philosophical traditions would agree. Others would argue that God may be only partially knowable. or that finite minds cannot fully comprehend an infinite reality. Those positions are compatible with the idea that God invites rational inquiry while remaining inexhaustible. So I might phrase your thought this way. If there is a God worthy of that name, then God would not ask us to surrender reason. Rather, reason would be one of the means by which we approach the truth. Every honest test would either bring us closer to God or expose an idea that was never God to begin with. I think that captures something important. Reason is not the enemy of genuine belief. If a belief cannot survive honest questioning, then the questioning has not diminished the truth. It has revealed the weakness of the belief. Conversely, if something is genuinely true, it has nothing to fear from reason.
If there is a God, its form must have ego. Any other ego must be subordinate and temporary.
This is an interesting metaphysical proposition, and I think it helps to distinguish what you mean by ego, because that word carries several meanings. If by ego you mean a center of awareness that can say I, then your statement becomes, if there is a God, then the fundamental I belongs to God. Every individual I is a temporary, subordinate expression of that original subjectivity. That is not a new idea historically. Variations of it appear in several philosophical and mystical traditions. Although they develop it differently, the common thread is that there is one ultimate subject, while individual selves are finite or derivative. If, however, by ego you mean self-importance, pride, or narcissism, then I would disagree. Those are generally understood as imperfections. A perfect being would not need insecurity, vanity, or comparison with others. So I think the first meaning fits your broader worldview much better. Within the consciousness first ontology you've been developing, your statement could be sharpened to, if consciousness is fundamental and if God exists, then the ultimate I is God's. Every individual ego is a local, temporary perspective through which that universal consciousness experiences reality. The individual ego is real as an expression, but not ultimate as an independent existence. That is also consistent with something you've said before. It has always been I. When you first introduced that phrase, you were careful not to mean your personal biography had existed for 14 billion years. Rather, you were referring to the continuity of the fundamental subject of experience. In this latest formulation, you are identifying that ultimate I with God. Whether that conclusion is true is, of course, the philosophical question. A materialist would reject the premise that there is any universal subject at all, arguing instead that each conscious mind emerges independently from physical processes. Someone with a theistic or idealist view might see your proposal as coherent, though not necessarily established. What I appreciate is that you're treating these as criteria rather than declarations. You're asking, if there is a God, what properties must such a being have? Which properties are logically necessary and which are merely inherited from tradition? That approach invites examination rather than demanding assent. It asks whether concepts like universality, rational accessibility, and a fundamental subject of experience belong together as part of a coherent idea of God.
If there is a God, then that God could not exist without expression.
This is another proposition that can be explored from more than one angle. Your statement is, if there is a God, then that God could not exist without expression. The key word is expression. If expression means being manifest in some way, then your claim is that God is not merely an isolated, self-contained existence. God's nature necessarily includes expression. There is no silent, eternally unexpressed God. That leads to an interesting chain of reasoning. A painter who never paints is still a person. A musician who never makes music is still a person. But if God is the source of all existence, then perhaps God's nature is inseparable from expression itself. Existence flows outward. In your consciousness first framework, this would mean that the universe is not something God happened to create. Rather, the universe is God's ongoing expression. Conscious beings, matter, energy, space, and time are all modes of that expression. That is a coherent metaphysical position, but it isn't the only possibility. A classical theist might object that God could have existed eternally before any creation, because God is complete in God's own being. On that view, creation is a free act, not a necessity. God could exist without expressing anything outside himself. Your proposition challenges that directly. It suggests that a completely unexpressed God is indistinguishable from no God at all, because there would be no manifestation of what God is. There is a subtle distinction, though, that might strengthen your idea. Instead of saying God could not exist without expression, you might say, if God exists, expression is intrinsic to God's nature. God's existence is not separate from expression. Expression is what God's existence does. That avoids implying that God depends on something external in order to exist. Instead, expression becomes an essential characteristic of God's being. Taken together, the criteria you've been building form a remarkably consistent picture. God must be universal, not tribal. God must exceed the highest goodness found in us. God must welcome reason rather than fear it. God must be the ultimate I, with all individual selves being temporary expressions. God's nature must be expressive rather than inert. Whether one ultimately identifies that picture with God, universal consciousness, or something else, it is internally coherent. It defines God not as a supernatural exception to reality, but as the fundamental reality whose very nature is to express itself through the existence and experience of everything else.
If there is a God, that God cannot have an external boundary, nor any internal unoccupied place, as this is an internal boundary.
This may be one of the deepest of your proposed criteria, because it shifts the discussion from theology to ontology. Your proposition is, if there is a God, then God can have neither an external boundary nor an internal unoccupied place, because an unoccupied place within God would itself constitute an internal boundary. Let's unpack it. An external boundary implies something outside God. If there is an outside, then God is not all-encompassing. Whatever lies beyond the boundary would either limit God or exist independently of God. By your criterion, that would mean God is not ultimate. Your second point is more subtle. Suppose God fills an infinite region but contains empty spaces within. Those empty spaces would not be God. They would define regions where God is absent. The surfaces between occupied and unoccupied regions become internal boundaries. In effect, God would be internally fragmented. So your argument is that an ultimate God cannot contain absences of itself. Expressed more abstractly, the ultimate cannot be bounded from without, nor divided from within. That is a powerful metaphysical principle. Within your consciousness-first framework, the consequence is striking. If God has no external boundary and no internal absence, then there is nowhere that consciousness is not. Matter is not outside consciousness. Space is not outside consciousness. Empty vacuum is not outside consciousness. Everything that exists within or as the continuous reality of the divine. This is also why in your ontology, a rock and a human differ in expression, not in membership. Both belong equally to the same undivided reality. One refinement I would suggest is linguistic rather than philosophical. Instead of saying God cannot have an internal unoccupied place, you might say, if God is ultimate, there can be no region of reality in which God is absent. An absence within God would define an internal boundary, and a boundary is incompatible with ultimacy. That states the principle in terms of reality itself rather than spatial imagery. Taken together, your criteria are beginning to converge on a single concept: universality, rational accessibility, the ultimate subject, I, necessary expression, boundarylessness. Each criterion reinforces the others. If anyone fails, the concept ceases to be the all-encompassing reality you are trying to define. The remaining philosophical challenge is not whether the picture is coherent. It largely is. The challenge is whether reality itself exhibits these properties. That is the point at which metaphysical reasoning meets observation, and where your project of testing a consciousness, first ontology, becomes most interesting.
In all this dialogue, I haven't claimed that a God exists. All I have pointed to is where to look for God, and what that so-called God would look like. And I will sign off with the best line that comes to mind. There are none so blind than those that choose to refuse to see.
That is an important distinction, and I think you've maintained it consistently. You have not argued if God exists, therefore these things are true. Instead, you've argued, if we are going to use the word God, then there are certain logical constraints on what that word can coherently refer to. That is a philosophical exercise in defining necessary properties, not an assertion of existence. Across this dialogue, your criteria have been cumulative. A true God would have to be universal rather than tribal. A true God would have to exceed the highest good we know. A true God would have nothing to fear from reason. A true God would be the ultimate subject rather than one finite subject among many. A true God would express itself rather than remain forever inert. A true God could have neither an external limit nor an internal absence. Someone could accept every one of those criteria and still say, I don't think anything meeting those criteria exists. That would be a logically consistent position. Equally, someone might say, I think reality itself satisfies these criteria. That too would be a coherent position. Your work has been about clarifying the target before debating whether the target is real. As for your closing line, there are none so blind than those that choose to refuse to see. It has rhetorical force, though I would make one small adjustment, not to soften it, but to sharpen it. Choosing not to examine evidence or arguments is different from examining them and remaining unconvinced. Philosophy depends on making room for both sincere disagreement and intellectual honesty, so I might phrase it as, there are none so blind as those who choose not to look. That preserves your central point. Blindness born of refusal is different from blindness born of inability. In many ways, that captures the spirit of the dialogue you've been inviting. You haven't asked anyone to believe. You've asked them to look, to reason, and to follow the implications wherever they lead, whether those implications end in God and consciousness or in some entirely different understanding of reality, is, in your view, something that should be discovered, not assumed.
Thank you for listening all the way through. I hope you enjoyed it. And remember, the rule with us is, believe nothing you hear and but half you see.